Good morning, everyone. I'm Ed Grier, Dean of the School of Business at Virginia Commonwealth University, and welcome everyone. This is our third session for business conversations, and so we welcome everyone that likes to join. We started these because of obviously COVID-19, and we wanted to give you some relevant information that related to the impact on the business world in general and econ overall. Well, this morning, we want to focus on real estate. And we have a great panel to join me this morning to talk about real estate. But before I introduce the panelists, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We have about 45 minutes this morning, and we're on Zoom technology. Many of you are used to Zoom by now. If you're not, welcome to Zoom. There's a chat feature in Zoom. If you have questions, please submit those. We've received some already. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So again, today's focus on real estate. I know we have a number of real estate professionals tuning in today, so welcome everyone. Well, what I'm going to do is introduce our panelists, and they'll give you their perspective for a few minutes, and then we'll turn it back over to me, and we'll start answering as many questions as we can. Again, we have about 45 minutes, and so we're looking forward to this great panel. The first panelist I would like to introduce is Jeff Gronning. Jeff is a great friend of the school. He's a graduate of VCU School of Business. He majored in accounting. He's also a CPA. I'm not biased toward accountants. Well, you know I am. I was one many years ago. But Jeff is a wonderful colleague. He came back and gave our commencement speech a few years ago. He did a wonderful job with that. Jeff is currently Executive Vice President of Columbia Properties, and he's also their Chief Investment Officer. Prior to joining Columbia, Jeff ran his own business. He was co-founder and partner of Normandy Partners, a private equity firm with a huge portfolio of real estate assets, over 14 million square feet, valued over $3.5 billion. Normandy was acquired by Columbia earlier this year, so Jeff is a busy man, so we're just pleased that he could spend some time with us this morning. The next panelist is a great colleague of mine, Dr. Brent Smith. He's a real estate professor in the School of Business and a wonderful guy. His office is right down the hall from mine in Sneed Hall, and I haven't seen him up close and personal for a while. We used to meet in the coffee room in the morning. We haven't done it in a while. I'm looking forward to that. Brent is a wonderful scholar. He received his MBA from the University of Notre Dame, and he stayed in the Hoosier State to earned not one, but two PhDs, one in econ geography and one in finance. So he's a wonderful scholar, as I said, and he's also the holder of one of our endowed chairs. And that endowed chair was made possible by a wonderful gift from the CoStar Group. It's the CoStar Endowed Chair in Real Estate Analytics. So that's Brent. So let me turn it over to Jeff for a few minutes. We'll start with Jeff, and then we'll go to Brent, and then we'll go to the Q&A portion. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you. I hope things are well in the great state of New Jersey. So how are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thanks. And good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dean Grier, for the opportunity to participate in today's program. As Dean Grier said, I'm a proud alum of the VCU School of Business. I graduated with an accounting degree 30 years ago this month. So this is a milestone for me. I've been actively involved in the commercial real estate industry for virtually all of my 30-year business career. Most of that time was spent focused on the capital markets, as well as managing two real estate private equity platforms. As the Dean noted, I recently merged a company I co-founded, Normandy Real Estate Partners, into a publicly traded office REIT, Columbia Property Trust, where I now serve as the company's chief investment officer. Dean Grier invited me to share some observations and insights into the impact COVID-19 is having on our real estate industry. And suffice it to say, these are unprecedented times. We've all been impacted in different ways, and some of us significantly more so than others. Our thoughts certainly go out to those who continue to struggle through these difficult times. Obviously, COVID has had a major impact on the global and national economy, the real estate markets, and life as we know it. In many respects, to me, this feels like the worst case scenario, with the possible exception being that there's an equally unprecedented fiscal and monetary intervention by the US government and the Federal Reserve. So we'll see how that plays out. But these are, clearly very difficult times from an economic point of view. During my 30-year business career, I've counted, 7 different crisis periods. All have been different, all very impactful, and all have resulted in lasting change. But they've also given way to new opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic, I think, will be no different than the rest in that respect. And to me, it feels like some combination of the fear that gripped the country in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, as well as the economic freefall that characterized the global financial crisis in 08 and 09. The good news is that we'll get through it and the economy will recover. The debate, I suppose, will be over the shape and the pace of that recovery. The real estate markets have suffered, equally dramatic effects from COVID-19 and, what is essentially the virtual shutdown of the US economy. Stay-at-home orders, the closure of non-essential businesses, the halting of construction projects have all dealt, pretty serious blow to commercial real estate. When you turn off the revenue streams of business from, what has now been 60 days or so, it's obviously not a good scenario for anybody, real estate included. So in addition, our largest real estate markets are our most densely populated geographies in the country. These locations have been particularly hard hit by the spread of the virus. And, as we sit here today, remain the most tightly quarantined markets across the country. When you think about it, the fact, is that the Northeast US and California, which account for our gateway cities and together represent more than half of the US GDP. These 2 regions in particular, the coastal markets, the Northeast, New England, are likely to be likely to lag the rest of the country in terms of reentry and ultimate recovery. The real estate markets themselves are, very highly nuanced and location specific. Our markets are characterized by different property types like office, retail, multifamily, industrial, and hotel. Exposure to real estate runs through both debt and equity. Securities and securities that are held by both publicly traded as well as private equity forms. So real estate permeates a lot of what we're about, and it touches many aspects of our overall economy. Each of these different subcategories has been impacted in different ways and to varying degrees. For example, if you look at the hotel sector, particularly hard hit and one of the first property types to really feel the impacts. Occupancy across the hotel sector has fallen from 70% to somewhere between 0 and 25%, with many properties actually closed or ordered closed. Hotels rent rooms nightly, so it's not that hard to imagine what happens when demand completely evaporates. And you can also, take it one step further and consider the additional impact on hotels that cater to large groups or convention businesses. Retail properties are also massively impacted. Retailers and restaurants aren't generating revenues, and therefore they aren't paying rent. Most retail landlords, at least in the public space, are collecting or reporting collections somewhere between 25 and 50% of billed rent for the month of April, and the month of May is likely to actually be worse. I know across my own portfolio that we manage, real estate is actually a very small part of our overall rent roll, but we collected about 56% of April rents that we billed to our retail tenants. Add to that the accelerating trend of online buying, which has picked up dramatically as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. You hear reports, you see reports on the news about Black Friday levels of volume for e-commerce and online buying. And that's a trend that's actually accelerating, and not one that is directly a result of COVID. But what COVID is doing is it's reinforcing a trend and accelerating a trend that was already underway, which was already having a major sort of disruptive effect on on the retail sector, retail property sector. And so while I think it really leads to questions about what is the future, what's the future of some of these retail properties. And clearly not every retail asset is going vacant, and each location is different. But I think the determination of winners and losers across this space is going to accelerate as a result of the macro trends that we're seeing. In the office sector, the physical occupancy of office buildings across the country and across the portfolio that I manage is effectively zero. Many cities have shut essential businesses, work from home, shelter in place, all that stuff, is having a direct impact on the occupancy of office buildings. I'd say the good news is that we, office landlords have longer term leases, and for the most part, commercial tenants have been able to work from home and to continue to carry on some level of business, and that translates to a much higher percentage of rent collected by office landlords, versus hotels and retail. So, by comparison, in the month of April, we collected, and most other office, portfolio managers have reported collecting, 95, 96, 97% of April billings. So, much more stability there. Definitely some unknowns about what the month of May will look like, and what the, impact will be if the economy doesn't reopen sooner than later. So that's office. In the in the office sector, we're also debating the impact of work from home. It is a sort of an experiment to see how it goes, and the natural extension of that is how is this going to impact the long-term demand for office space. At the same time, we're actually witnessing a reversal in the trend toward densification and co-working. When you need to work 6 feet apart instead of 3 feet apart, and you do the space plan on that, it means you need a lot more space. And so there's some conflicting currents, I guess, that are working their way through the office sector, and it remains to be seen how long this social distancing, how long the move away from densification will last, whether it'll be permanent, and and similarly what the impact of work from home will be. I would say the winner property types so far have been or appear to be industrial and life sciences. Industrial for all of the reasons I described in my comments about retail. That property type and market fundamentals are being reinforced by the growth of e-commerce. And, this trend is certainly accelerating as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, look, industrial's had a lot of, wind in its sails for several years, leading into where we are today. And my point is that, those trends are just being reinforced by the pandemic. Life sciences is another winner. Life science has been somewhat of a niche property type historically, but I think life sciences is definitely poised for significant growth given the likely increase in investment, for biological and healthcare research, and the need to provide the facilities and the properties to support that growth. There's certain nodes around the country that cater toward life sciences: Cambridge, Mass., San Francisco, San Diego, in particular, that could actually be big winners coming out of out of this in the recovery. Multifamily assets have also held up reasonably well. I think most landlords that I'm tracking are reporting, collecting 95% rents month over month for April. The property type is obviously correlated to a lot of the fiscal stimulus that has come into the economy, in terms of increased unemployment benefits, PPP, and directing funds to those individuals who then in turn use those funds to pay rent and address other necessities. So multifamily seems to be holding up along with life sciences and industrial. And I think when you look at it, all of this is borne out by the stock price of publicly traded companies. That's, sort of daily price setting mechanism, actively traded markets, a lot of transparency. And if you look at, how these stocks have performed, no sector is immune to what's going on, but, hotel and retail stocks are down 50% year to date. Office stocks are down roughly 30%, multifamily down 22%, and industrial is down sub 10%. So that kind of gives you a sense for what, what the investors in real estate are saying about the impacts of COVID on these companies. The debt markets are pretty much frozen for real estate right now, in particular for the more impacted property types. You probably can't finance a hotel or a retail asset today. When you get a shock like this, the first instinct is to freeze. Owners look to safeguard their assets and stockpile liquidity. And I would say it's a very inopportune time to have a maturing loan or to be a highly leveraged borrower. One thing that's also interesting is that mortgage REITs, companies that hold and invest in residential and commercial loans, have actually been very hard hit. You wouldn't think that would be the case, but if you look at the way these companies actually capitalize themselves, you'll see instances where they're levered essentially 9 to 1, because of that, are facing margin calls from their lenders as the value of the securities that they hold declines. And it's, there's a corresponding inability of, these companies to actually make good on these margin calls. So those stocks have been down, 60, 70%. They've come back a little bit because it was kind of the baby out with the bathwater, but there's some real distress in that sector. To conclude, I'd say on the plus side, interest rates are really low. The markets will reopen. The availability of credit for real estate should be a tailwind for the market going forward. And we're also seeing lenders that are being much more flexible toward borrowers than they were in the 08-09 crisis. So rent, mortgage interest deferrals for 90 days to, kind of help, retail and hotel owners, kind of navigate through the loss of revenue. And we'll see how long that can continue. It can't go on indefinitely, but I think at the urging of, of our government, there's been some real flexibility there in a way that we didn't see in the last crisis. And so I think that's a good thing. And just to close it out, we, as I said, we've been through many of these crises before. There's definitely damage being done. There will be winners and losers. And I think, our goal is to figure out, and adapt to, where the opportunities are that come out of this. And one thing I've seen in across my 30 years in business is that when you go through a crisis like this or others, there's always opportunities on the other side that, that investors can take advantage of. So with that, I will stop and turn it back to Dean Grier.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. That's a lot, and it's a lot to think about, certainly with all the aspects of real estate, from retail to life science is one thing I didn't touch upon. I wasn't thinking about right away, but that's an interesting fact also. Brent, I'll turn it over to you just to give your perspective, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Brent, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean Grier. As the Dean said, my name is Brent Smith. I'm a professor at VCU in the School of Business in the Department of Finance, Insurance, and Real Estate. I also am honored to serve as the co-star chair in real estate analytics. The position was made possible by a generous donation from the co-star group and Andy Florence. One of the many benefits that I've received from that relationship with co-star is that I've been granted access to the vast data that they've collected, which has been instrumental in conducting my research of late. I recently completed a few papers exploring the medical office building market, and I'm currently working on a joint project with some folks there at co-star on a nationwide exploration of some factors that influence cap rates. On Monday, Jeff and I and Dean Grier and other colleagues met to discuss the format of this discussion. At the time, the Dean said that we would have, roughly 10 minutes or so to do some opening remarks on the real estate market, how we might see things going forward post the virus. The first thought that I had, and one that's been with me since about 5 minutes ago, was how do I encapsulate what we're seeing, what we're witnessing, and what we're likely to experience during such an unprecedented once-in-a-century event into about 5 or 10 minutes. Well, I could ramble on all day through the entire 45-minute session. But what I did was I tried to hone in on 3 themes that I'm kind of focusing on right now, that I'm looking at, and how I think that these 3 themes kind of give us an indication or a light into what we may see in the future. The first one is habitualization. It's a word that was coined by a couple of sociologists, Berger and Luckman, in 1966, and it means pretty much what it sounds like. Any action that is repeated frequently enough gets cast into a pattern. The next is innovation, and of course we know what innovation means. Anytime there's a shock in the world of the economy, innovation tends to take over and take precedent and sprouts new and innovative ideas. And then finally, the other theme is recession. And what would I be if I weren't an economic academic if I didn't think a little bit about the prospects of recession? But I want to put a question mark around it just in case, we still don't know what the outcome will be. We know that there's going to be some downturns, but how long will it last? PwC just did a survey just recently, and of the respondents, 30 to 40% of them said the market would be recovered within 3 to 4 months. So there's still some optimism left in the market. And that raises the question of whether the recession is inevitable or not. So let's go through these 3 themes together. The first one, again, is that habitualization and how habits become ingrained and in some cases institutionalized. As an example, my wife works for Amazon. Jeff mentioned Amazon and online buying in their distribution and logistics area. Over the last 6 weeks, they have seen total sales or total shippings that have approached typical holiday levels. Unprecedented sales of things like bread makers and chair mats and nail salon equipment. Think about this, it's all designed to substitute for what we were previously purchasing out in retail locations. Another example, an organization out of Washington, D.C., it's called South Mountain Creameries. They deliver fresh and organic milk to houses, kind of like we used to see in the old days with the milkman in the box at the front door. Pre-virus, they were making about 5,500 deliveries a week. Today, that's 9,500. And they have a waiting list for 6,000 more. Just the other day, I read where Nationwide Insurance said that 98% of its workforce is working from home. And they announced last week that they're going to make this a permanent state for all employees, except for those in their main campus housing offices. Now think about this metaphorically for just a minute. Think about the fitness experience that so many of us have either experienced ourselves or seen our friends and relatives encounter. Every year, gyms see this explosive growth in January, right? As part of the Get Fit resolution kicking in. Long about the end of February, most of those have faded away, but there is always a subset that hangs in there for that 6 weeks that it takes to create a habit, and they remain. It's been 6 weeks and more since we initiated the isolation moves, and we've created some new habits, and a significant portion of the population will retain some of those habits into the future, buying online, working at home, and etc. And this has the potential to impact the real estate market in material ways. On the innovation front, We have a long history of evidence that illustrates that when markets are challenged, the weak fail and the strong innovate and adapt. Examples that I've observed, not necessarily new, but are experiencing dramatically expanded usage and acceptance, include such things as telemedicine. Again, it's been around a while, but the use has expanded extensively. Virtual property tours. There are realtors that sit in the car, and while the potential purchaser walks through, they explain the nuances and the amenities of the property without even entering. I mean, think about what they could do actually if you expand a little bit for those Sunday open house examples. You could literally host 10 or 12 houses from your office on a set of computer screens and monitors and so forth. There's cross-firm employee sharing that's occurring right now, where there's attempts to reduce unemployment in the harder hit sectors, such as restaurant workers working in grocery stores. This discussion that we're involved in right this minute is an excellent example of adaptation. I was on a panel last week where I did a discussion on a paper with the folks from the University of Cambridge. And there were real estate academics from around the world, just like you, watching and listening and learning from the experience that we had. That wasn't something that would even been considered before this virus. And nearly the entire academic community needs to be applauded as they innovated on the fly to bring online courses to ensure continued delivery to the students this past semester. Across the country, faculty members ensured that students did not have a disruption in their coursework as they attempted to finish their degrees and so forth. I'm sure you guys have others that you've experienced along with numerous workplace changes, many of which will likely be a regular fixture in our post-virus world. And finally, the word everybody loves and everybody hates at the same time, recession. Well, before the virus, we were basking the pleasures provided by the longest period of continual economic expansion in US history. We all were very comfortable with the way things were going, but we also all know, everyone on here is well aware that nothing good lasts forever when it comes to the economy. And a softening is inevitable. I have been thinking, as I looked at things, that there were some signals even before the virus that maybe 21, we were going to see a little bit of a soft landing into something that wasn't a continual growth trajectory, but I wasn't exactly sure what it was going to entail, and I wasn't certain what the trigger would look like. If you think about the financial crisis in 2007, some evidence suggests that the trigger that precipitated that was the Federal Reserve's quarterly interest rate hike over a 2-year period. Is the virus that triggers this particular economy to a slowdown that persists beyond the enforced lockdowns? Well, there are some signs that are worth looking at. The savings rate recently at its highest level since 1981. That's a strong sign of decreased spending. Increases in saving typically signal an economic downturn. Now, it's worth posing a question, is that economic concern that's causing that savings rate to go up, or is it simply less buying opportunity? A lot of folks will cast back in history and applaud the folks that lived in the 1940s for their wonderful discipline in saving, when in reality, they were only saving more than everyone else because there was nothing to buy. Everything was going towards the war market. But there are other signals as well. If I can go across the pond for a second, car sales in the UK last month were down 97%. And again, is that causal because of economic concern, or is it simply a matter of people aren't out buying? Well, everyone on the call here has heard about the unemployment, so I won't deal into that too much. Most of the folks are well aware that there's large unemployment issues, and it's going to continue into the future. Those folks that are unemployed are not spending, and they're not likely to start spending, as they're going to be busy playing catch up. The National Multifamily Housing Council indicated in April that roughly 25 to 35% of renters did not make full payments. And that was in April. And we're continuing to see these layoffs and unemployment claims into May. So the likelihood of that backstop beyond the stimulus check is uncertain. 9% of retail CMBS mortgages were not paid in April, and that's up from 1.7% in March. 20% of the lodging industry mortgages are either in or past their grace period. And USB's consumer credit gauge hit its lowest point since 2009. Well, what about the residential market? What's hard to say right now, because data in that market tends to lag a bit. So I'm not going to be able to glean any conclusions based on what I'm seeing at the moment. But what I am looking at in the future is an increase in inventory that will translate, of course, into softer prices and a longer time on the market. Why might that be? Well, in many cases, builders that have permits that aren't slowed down by closures in government office buildings and so forth, they've continued to build. Further, regardless of the virus, life cycle changes continue. Births, deaths, job changes, divorce, etc. all motivate people to move, sell, or otherwise change their housing situation. So houses will keep coming on the market, but are buyers coming on the market? And are financial institutions and investors going to maintain the liquidity even in the face of these low interest rates? And then one other one that I will just point out real quickly so we can get into the questions. I want you to keep an eye on local government fiscal stability. For those of you that are local, think about Henrico County, for example. A large source of their revenue stream comes from sales tax revenues, of which, of course, they're collecting relatively little compared to what they were pre-virus. And that will spill over into services that are provided by those local institutions. And that will, of course, have an influence on the interest and viability of that particular sector for real estate purchases. So this is just a synopsis of some of the things that I'm looking at, I'm thinking about, and that I'm watching. In short, I anticipate that these changes, through creating habits, through innovation, and the potential for recession, will have an influence on our real estate market. At the same time, much like Jeff, I'm confident that there will be opportunities for us to move forward. The economy will eventually recover. We will adapt to those changes and move forward into the foreseeable future, just as we always have in the past. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ed for some Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brent. Great comments as well. I think there's an awful lot to talk about. There are a number of questions that have come in already. So let's, let me take this thing off. Okay, number of questions. Jeff, let me turn to you for this question and relate it to office space from a corporate standpoint. You mentioned that it's pretty strong so far. The landlords are collecting rents. I think you said something like 95% of April. Now that may change for May, of course. Well, how do you feel like the long term? You know, I think Brent just talked about, I think it was State Farm, he said that they said, okay, you can work from home now. They don't need the office space. Are you nervous about that? Are you seeing that could be a shrinking demand from a corporate standpoint for office space? If you can just touch on that just a bit.
Unmute.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. It's the $64,000 question, I think. Whenever you go through a shock, a change like this, there's lasting permanent impacts that will emerge. And 08, 09, we saw this trend, massive trend toward urbanization, right? So cities like New York City, markets like Midtown South became very strong appeal to like the high growth industries, tech and TAMI and the like. And so that was in some ways, I think, one of the effects or impacts that came out of the 08, 09 crisis. There's just kind of a fundamental shift in trends and demand patterns. And so this will be no different. There's going to be shifts. I think the jury's out as to exactly what they are. But clearly, work from home. Everyone's doing it. It's a massive experiment. If you watch the news, like I do all day, every day, while I'm doing my work, you hear about it. The CEO of Morgan Stanley, kind of on record saying that, that he sees a future with less need for office space, more people working from home, and others. But you have to step back. You have to ask the question, number one, how productive are you really working from home when you're operating in an economic environment that is, running on 3 or 4 cylinders and not all 8, right? So that's one question. Number two, and I think, I'll speak for myself and my colleagues, and many others that I've heard, kind of opine on this. While working from home is great, you miss the the interaction, the collaboration. We're social animals. People want to be together, and the place for them to be together is is in an office environment. It's nice to be here on the screen with you all, but it's just not the same, as being in meetings, reading people's body language, collaborating, and, making deals. So I think, I think there's different cross currents and, that need to be evaluated. And, the jury's just out on that. I do worry about, I don't worry about the future of office so much as I worry about the type of office that tenants and employees are going to want to sit in, right? Do they want to be in 50-story office towers where you've got to put 30 people on an elevator to get to your 50th floor office? Who knows, right? Or would they rather be in low-rise buildings where some people can walk up steps and down steps if that's what they want to do? What will be the impact on office buildings that are dependent on mass transit, like New York City, where you've got 8 million people a day riding the subway? How comfortable are they going to feel, getting on the subway when everyone's talking about, keeping 6 feet apart? So I think there's questions like that are going to change the demand patterns and will ultimately have an impact on the supply and demand of office space that we just don't know yet. But clearly, this work from home scenario is an important experiment that we're going through right now.
Jeff, we had a question that came in that was touched upon something you just mentioned about how comfortable people are right on the subways or being in the elevator together. Have you and your colleagues talked about what you can do as an industry to tell people these are safe so they can feel comfortable in the office space? Or what are they thinking about I know we talked about social distancing. Anything else in the office space that gives people the comfort level that it's okay to return to the office? Have you talked about that at all?
Yeah, I'm reasonably confident that we can create a safe office environment for tenants and employees, our customers. You can do that through distancing. You can do it through limiting the number of people that are on an elevator at any given time. You can have drop-off points for food deliveries. You can require tenants in the building and their guests to wear PPE for the foreseeable future. You can have, constant cleaning, disinfecting of common areas. You can close amenities for at least on a temporary basis until we sort everything out. Tenants themselves can employ social distancing practices by, maybe it's, rotating employees through the building during the week, having, groups of employees working every other day or whatever it is, or, just doing things to implement a 6-foot distancing protocol across their space. So I'm not that concerned about that. And there's other things you can do too beyond that, with air quality, purification, bipolar ionization, HVA systems, more fresh air circulating through the building. A lot of things you can do to make buildings healthier. So I feel like we have a pretty good grip on that. I think the thing that's much less within, my control and other landlords' control is how people actually get to their office, and if you're a city like, New York or DC or San Francisco or Chicago, mass transit's a big part of that. And I think I don't feel like I have all the answers for how that works out. I know everybody can't drive their car and park in the city. It would be a 5-hour commute probably for me personally, but and that's not the answer. So I think there's more to come on that.
Okay, great. We have about 5 minutes. So I might give a multiple question and I'll let Jeff or Brent answer this. One is about medical office space. Brent, you mentioned that a bit. You're starting to work on that. Any early indications on the work you've seen on medical office, what the impact has been on medical office space? The other question is about, well, like this, gyms and things like that. And then that's kind of it's more than a niche. A lot of workout places and restaurants, things like that. So, Brent, if you can kind of cover those, and then I'll try to squeeze in one more question.
So on the gyms, we've already seen Gold Gyms as filed for reorganization. They're planning on closing quite a few hundred spaces. The gyms are going to feel a big pinch, and if we're going to continue to open when we're still uncertain, I'm not sure how you're going to do it. How are you going to grab a barbell after somebody else has already worked out with it? We're going to walk around clean after everybody, moves to another station. So they're going to have their hands full on how they deal with it, obviously. There's programming angles that you can take that could allow people to continue to work out. And fitness is an important component of this society. And it's a relevant element of how, as Jeff said, how we socialize, between work and happy hour and working out. Those are the kinds of things that bring us together, to allow us to be those social beings that Jeff mentioned that we are. Back to the medical office building space, the doctors that I've spoken with of late have talked already about how their spaces are going to be transferred in a number of different ways, not the least of which is because until there's a vaccine in the short term, everybody's considered a threat, right? So there's all these tests that have to be taken. Temperature tests are being taken as they walk in the room. Each of the rooms have to be disinfected when they leave. But the other thing that they did mention, and we're on this as Jeff mentioned, the experiment, telemedicine seems to be taking a big place in a lot of different environments that it wasn't necessarily always the case. In other words, it might serve to actually reduce the need for seeing your patients or seeing the number of patients on a daily basis that you're familiar with in the past.
Okay, great. And this is it's more than a niche also, and maybe I'll give this to Jeff. And there was a question about retirement communities and seemingly, and they are obviously hard hit, and it seems to spread very rapidly there. And the number of REITs involved in those retirement communities. Jeff, do you have any insights into that one at all? I know it's a little more specific than you normally do, but do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, honestly, it's not my area of expertise. I think that clearly, assisted living facilities, nursing homes, more densely populated facilities with elderly, vulnerable people have been incredibly hard hit here in the Northeast and in New Jersey in particular, New York State. I don't know what the long-term solution is for that. I do think that, the factors that are, present today were driven, one, by the vulnerable population that is there, but two, by the early spread of the virus that really wasn't addressed or detected. And so you had people going out of these facilities into the hospital, coming back, spreading the infection inside of the facility. You had healthcare workers that didn't know what the virus was, that weren't wearing PPE and coming into contact with multiple patients. So that was really a worst case scenario, and clearly something that needs to be addressed. Whether that means that these facilities just get a lot less dense, or there's some other solution. Obviously, a vaccine would change a lot, but I don't have any particular expertise in that.
Yeah. Okay, you've answered it, and I think there are so many more questions coming in. Unfortunately, we don't have time enough to answer them, so I do apologize for that. So we're out of time. So I want to please thank our two panelists, Jeff and Brent. You're great, as we knew you would be. So thank you for spending time with us this morning. We will, this is recorded, so we will send out the links to this recording, and a lot of valuable information was shared by Brent and for Jeff. So I thank him for that. And thank you all for participating with us this morning in our third session of Business Conversation. So we'll see you at the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.